Today at 2.
On today's True Crime, it's every parent's worst nightmare. You drop your child off at daycare, you go to work, only later to be told that your baby has been physically abused and died at the hands of those you trusted. That is what devastated parents Amy and Andrew Kingen were led to believe when their toddler Benjamin tragically passed away on January 14, 2009. But substantial evidence cast serious doubt on the conviction of the daycare worker charged with the murder of baby Benjamin. On January 14, 2009, the tragic death of 16-month-old Benjamin Kingen shattered a quiet Chicago suburb. And 22-year-old daycare aide Melissa Calusinski was at the center of it all. After discovering the toddler's unresponsive body in his bouncy seat at the daycare center where she worked, Melissa says she called the front desk for help after Benjamin began foaming at the mouth. Police and paramedics arrived on the scene within minutes, and the child was taken to a nearby hospital. But it was too late. Benjamin was pronounced dead before his parents were able to say goodbye to their baby boy. The reported cause of death? Brain injuries and a skull fracture caused by blunt trauma, which the coroner compared to a 2-story fall. Police interrogated Melissa for nearly 10 hours without an attorney. She denied any involvement in Benjamin's death and reported 79 times before she confessed to throwing the toddler to the floor in frustration.
You threw him on the floor?
Yeah, really hard.
Really hard?
Yeah.
Show us how hard you threw him on the ground.
I went like that.
Okay.
Immediately after, Melissa recanted her confession, but no one was listening. Despite her claims the confession was coerced, Melissa was tried and convicted of first-degree murder. In February 2012, she was sentenced to 31 years in prison. In 2015, a new coroner uncovered better quality versions of the x-rays that were originally provided to the defense team, which he said showed no signs of a skull fracture, enabling him to reclassify the toddler's cause of death from homicide to undetermined. But despite this new evidence, Melissa's appeals have been denied, and she remains behind bars to this day. Melissa's father, Paul, is here, along with Jason Flom. He's a founding board member of the Innocence Project and host of the popular podcast Wrongful Conviction with Jason Flom. In addition to justice reform, he's also a music industry powerhouse. He signed artists like Kid Rock, Katy Perry, Lorde. A very different place than you are now. How'd you get so passionate about criminal justice reform?
Well, Doc, I became aware of the work of the Innocence Project, which was at that time a new organization, which was founded by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, who realized that you could, with DNA, prove guilt or innocence with scientific certainty. And so they created this magnificent organization that has freed hundreds of people. People like Melissa. She's not a client of ours, but so many of these cases have been resolved, and so many laws and practices have been changed through the work of the Innocence Project.
So let's focus in on Melissa. Paul, 11 years ago, your daughter was arrested. What has it been like for your family? How difficult has it been watching her in prison, believing she's innocent?
Well, it's been really hard, especially around the holidays. She's recently lost both grandmothers and her brothers. They have a hard time seeing her. My other daughter, she's now in a different state, and she has, again, she can't get the kids and herself to come to where she's at. They wonder where Aunt Melissa's at. It's hard when you gotta tell the kids what happened to their aunt, and for something she didn't do, she's sitting there. It's just hard.
Well, let's unwrap the story a little bit, because most people are sitting at home watching right now and thinking, how's this possible? What really happened? She just confessed. We just saw her on camera saying she threw the baby down forcefully to the floor, and that was why the child may have died. Why do you think she said that during the confession if she was innocent?
That segment that you showed there, that was approximately almost 9 hours into the interrogation. 79 times she denied that she ever tried and did anything to that child. At the time that they interrogated her, they used foul language, They said they knew what she did, they knew what happened to the kid, and she even offered to take a lie detector test. I mean, she loved that child.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to show the audience just a snippet from the first 9 hours of the confession.
Okay.
This is one of Melissa's
It's hard
denials.
for me to see this, so I apologize if I tear up.
That story you're giving us is a load of Because they just did an experiment.
Okay, but that is what I am telling you. But I didn't hit him, I didn't pick him up, I didn't throw him on the ground, I didn't drop him on the tile, I didn't hit him against the wall. That was it. I am completely honest.
There's no way that that would have cracked his skull.
Okay, but I didn't crack his skull.
Okay, one thing I want to tell you. They told her what they thought happened to the child. They put it in her head. Then they leave her in the room by herself, and you can hear her talking to herself saying, I'm not a baby killer. I didn't do this.
Jason, how common is this that innocent people confess to a crime they didn't commit? I mean, that just seems impossible for most of us to believe.
No, and I'm glad you asked, because the fact is, and I think the audience will be very surprised by this, but in the first 150 cases that we studied of wrongful convictions that were proven by DNA to have been false, right? So scientifically proven, and people released as a result. 25% of those cases involved false confessions. And people,
1 in 4.
1 in 4, yeah. And so I implore everyone in the audience, if you ever get picked up for something you didn't do, you only need to say 4 words. Those words are, I want a lawyer. If Melissa had said that, none of this would have happened.
Up next, we're going to take a look at the damning evidence that suggests the prosecution got their facts wrong. Plus details about a mysterious phone call that flipped the case upside down. In 2012, Melissa Calusinski was only 25 years of age when she was sentenced to 31 years in prison for the murder of toddler Benjamin Kingen. Now, since her conviction, Melissa has maintained her innocence and is still fighting for her freedom. We are back with Jason Flom and Melissa's father, Paul Calusinski. So what was the prosecution's case against Melissa?
They basically had no case. So they had the false confession, which they, extracted after 16 hours of questioning, after 79 denials from her, right? And everybody has their breaking point, Doc. You want to get out of there.
But there was one clue that the police had that we now are questioning, a clue that got them to get her to confess, and that was the issue of a skull fracture.
That's right, Doc. They told her, right, and they told the jury that the baby's skull was fractured.
So that was the story. And if I was in the jury, if any of you were in the jury, and you hear this confession, and you hear a fractured skull, and no one's copying to it, well, you could put the pieces together and make a case. But in 2015, Paul, you get an anonymous phone call, claiming there was more than one set of x-rays on Benjamin Kingen's skull that you needed to know about, that you had not seen nor had the defense team seen.
Exactly. There was a second set of x-rays.
So joining us now via Zoom is Thomas Rudd. He's the former Lake County coroner. Thanks in part to those additional x-rays and baby Benjamin's medical reports, Dr. Rudd was able to reclassify Benjamin's death from homicide to undetermined. It's a big shift in 2015. Dr. Rudd, what did you find that enabled you to reclassify Benjamin's death? That's a big step.
Yes, it is. After Paul called me, we went to our computer that has the files on this child's death and x-rays, and when they were printed up, they were very clear, and they clearly indicated no skull fracture. And that floored me because in testimony it was mentioned 32 times. Now, at the same time, I was examining the patient's chart, and I found a significant injury occurring 6 weeks before the child died. Melissa, I must point out, was not employed at the time, so they can't pin it on her. 6 weeks prior to his death, he awoke from a nap, crying uncontrollably with a large bump at the back of his head. They had to call the mom to pick him up to take him home. Allegedly, I think she took him to a pediatrician the next day and they found nothing.
So I'd like to take a look at this evidence. Let's just pretend we're back in the courtroom now. To me, it's a fundamental combination of two issues. A fractured skull, which someone had to fracture, and a confession from a young woman who was right there when it happened, and she was the only one there. You put those two together, you can understand why the jury went the way they went. But let's go over this. So, Thomas, I put the x-ray up here so everyone can see it. Thomas, do you see a fracture in this skull, a break in the line?
There is no break in the line. There's no fracture in this skull where they allegedly found it anatomically on the skull. This is a normal skull film. It was reviewed by multiple experts. And one more thing, Dr. Oz, a child's skull is generally bigger than the rest of his body. But please note, and this is very significant, despite it being large, it is the size of a light bulb, which is abnormal because most of our heads are egg-shaped. So this is not a normal image as far as size. It is normal as far as no skull fracture.
So the shape wasn't normal, but also there was a change in head circumference. This little boy, until he was about 12 months of age, was at the 50th percentile, right along the middle here, right? Just where he's supposed to be, 50th percentile. But after the age of 12 months, Benjamin's head circumference went from the 50th percentile to the 92nd percentile. What was going on differently in his skull? And let me, if I can, offer a thought. Dr. Rudd, you saw this. When you recognized this shift, did that signify something to you?
It alerted me to that something was going on in the brain of this child. Remember, his growth of his skull spurted right after the injury 6 weeks prior to death. And we know that the child was rambunctious as he was approaching his twos, but he was the type that they called headbangers. So he would be in an activity and he'd bounce his head a lot. What was happening was he was re-injuring himself. He probably had the hematoma at 6 weeks prior to his death.
Dr. Rudd, hold on a second. Let me show everyone the hematomas we're talking about. So if we go inside of the skull to explain why this happened, this is what Dr. Rudd found. He found the normal head, the bone, and the covering of the bone is here, but this big red stuff here, that's a blood clot. That's called a hematoma. Like if someone were to punch you, get a Charlie horse, a big swelling in there, and you found this hematoma, and then you looked inside that hematoma, and you found little bits of iron. If you don't mind, put the whole picture together for us now. What happened to him 6 weeks before he died that caused this hematoma that you identified as with having iron in it that may have led to his skull growing and may have led to his death?
Very simply put, this is a scab, and a scab will only occur when the injury is healing. So if this was an acute injury, that arrow showing the scab would not have been there. It occurs 1 to 2 days after the injury. And the best way to prove that it is a scab is because the granulation tissue will absorb red cells which have iron. So I did a stain for iron. Lo and behold, it's positive, which means the injury is old and not acute, and therefore Melissa could not have caused the death of this child.
That's pretty darn damning. That's coming from the medical examiner. And again, studies have shown that young children who have bleeds like this, because of the extra pressure inside of the brain, will push the skull open, creating that change that we noticed. But there was no skull fracture. It is something that happened before. Dr. Rudd, thank you very much. So, Jason, I mean, you put this all together, and I'm hoping the audience is all with us on this. I would think you'd present this to the prosecution, to the judges, where Melissa is, and they'd say, oh my goodness, there was a terrible miscarriage of justice. The conviction is actually based on a confession that was clearly wrong. Why isn't she out right now? Why hasn't the court upheld with these new developments her acquittal?
You know, it's really a sad an indictment of our system that it is so easy to wrongfully convict someone.
Let me come back to this. Up next, did the prosecution intentionally hide the higher quality x-rays from Melissa's defense? Was it done on purpose? Stay with us. We've been talking about the conviction of daycare worker Melissa Calusinski for the murder of toddler Benjamin Kingen, but she has always maintained her innocence. The prosecutors claim Benjamin suffered a skull fracture after being dropped on his head by Melissa. But subsequent x-ray evidence appears to refute this argument. We're back with Jason Flom, the host of the podcast Wrongful Conviction with Jason Flom, and Melissa's father, Paul Calusinski. Joining us now also is Melissa's original trial attorney, Paul DeLuca. Now, Paul, you were there. You saw all the things you were given or allowed to see. Were you surprised when Dr. Thomas Rudd shared that he had these updated x-rays you had never seen before?
I was stunned, but not surprised entirely, because the trial was such, and I'm going to characterize it, it was a dirty trial. This prosecutor was allowed to cheat. They ambushed us at the end of the trial with certain evidence, and I was stunned, but again, not surprised when the evidence came out.
Don't you have to follow certain due process in court? How do you just surprise the defense with things? How do you hide evidence that you have and they don't get?
Well, about approximately 6 weeks before the trial, the prosecutor, one of the prosecutors, gave me the x-rays, which turned out to be three, basically blank x-rays. She said at the time, and this is significant, she said, Judge, here's the x-rays. We can't open them, but we're going to give them to Mr. DeLuca. We'll see if the person at the coroner's office can figure this out. I said, okay. I go back to the office. I try to play him. I can't play him. I can't play him, and I'm not a computer expert, so I call my secretary. Can you help me with this? We have the directions. Nothing. I mean, I think you may have them, but I move on. And then eventually, a few days later, one of the prosecutors tells me, we can't open these. We just can't open them. And again,
how did they prove there was a skull fracture if they weren't able to see x-rays?
The way they did it, Dr. Choi, the first pathologist, said he felt the fracture. He saw it
with his finger?
Yes. Dr. Montez, the witness that ambushed us at the end of the trial, who prepared no notes, no documents, took no photographs whatsoever, he said he put his finger in there as well and felt the rigid edges.
So he felt the fracture himself?
That's what he said.
Did he?
No, I don't think Dr. Montez actually did the autopsy, according to the evidence that was presented at the trial. The deputy coroner, Paul Foreman, said he never did an autopsy. He never looked at the child. He never did anything like that. The reason, again, why I think the coroner is telling the truth, Dr. Montez prepared no notes. He did not prepare a report. He did not take notes. He did not photograph anything. And he claims that he, for example, manipulated the brain. The problem with that is Dr. Choi, the day before, had sectioned the brain. He could not have touched the brain. The brain was dissected already. But Dr. Montez, the circumstances of his alleged looking at this body were so suspicious. Again, he prepared no documents, no notes.
So despite all of this, Lake County prosecutors deny any wrongdoing and maintain the child suffered a fractured skull before his death. Personally, I think this is a medical decision, not a legal decision, whether there's a fracture or not, and it seems to me there wasn't a fracture. So with that disconnect, what is the next step, Paul? How are you going to help Melissa?
Right now, she is she's in federal court in Chicago. So she's petitioned a federal court to give her a new trial or dismiss the case. The expert testified that that particular x-ray, now I was given that x-ray on September 7th. The trial was at the end of October 2011. The expert determined, how they determined it, that the x-ray was created. So that x-ray with no data, very little data, was created sometime in the afternoon hours, the day before. Who did it? Well, the last person who had the x-rays last, either the coroner or the prosecution.
I'm struggling with whether there was a crime at all. This is, most of the time on the show, I'm trying to say, well, he didn't kill somebody. Maybe they did.
Well, the crime is that my daughter's in prison for a crime she didn't do. She's doing time for no crime.
But Jason, how common are wrongful convictions like this upheld despite evidence that clearly she seems to show, in this case, there wasn't really a crime. There was no fractured skull. And what are your thoughts around Melissa's conviction being overturned?
It's frighteningly common that these things don't get resolved, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of innocence, as in Melissa's case. And even in the cases where, as you said, there was no crime committed at all. This was a tragic accident. We all wish that baby would still be with us today. But the fact is, you know, it was a medical problem, not a criminal problem. And she is serving this horrendous sentence for a crime that never happened. Everyone should know she's innocent. Now, as far as answering your question, what are her prospects for getting out? You know, I believe she'll get out. I believe she will be freed from prison. She has an incredible legal team led by Kathleen Zellner, who has been responsible for overturning, you know, a tremendous number of wrongful convictions. Very talented and skilled attorney. Also, you know, if everything else fails, I'm hoping that the governor will take a look at this. I think that governors are given the power of clemency for a reason. And if this case doesn't scream out for that type of mercy and justice and clemency, then I don't know what does.
Hallelujah. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it very much. Good luck with Melissa. Don't forget to check out Jason's podcast, Wrongful Conviction with Jason Flom. We'll be right back.